All right. For our last panel of today, and thank you all for sticking with us throughout the day. The questions from the audience have been terrific, so we appreciate it. I have the great fortune of introducing a stellar panel here. To my immediate left is Kramer McDonald, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, a career diplomat. Kara, thank you so much for making the trip to be with us here today. To her left is Dan Twining, longtime friend and colleague, who is the president of the International Republican Institute, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm on his board. Keti Khutsishvili is with the Open Society Georgia Foundation and a longtime friend and activist here. We really appreciate your being here too. You didn't have far to come. Next to her is Žygimantas Pavilionis, also a longtime friend, former ambassador to the United States for Lithuania and now in the Lithuanian parliament. And last but not least is Yascha Mounk, who is with SAIS, Johns Hopkins, and an expert on these issues. I couldn't ask for a better panel here, so thank you. Kara, let me start with you. I want to ask, you have responsibility for Europe and Eurasia within the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. You have your hands full. Give us a sense of the landscape that you're dealing with, the priorities as you look at this region.
Thank you, David. Am I reading? Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. First, let me just say a big thank you to the Bush Institute, George W. Bush Institute, to the McCain Institute, to EPRC, Evelyn, David, Nino. It is an absolute stellar group of brain trusts that you've put together here today and tomorrow. I am looking forward to learning as much, I hope, as I'm able to contribute. So thank you for allowing me to participate. Let me first start out by just saying, the title of our panel is Democracy versus Authoritarianism. I'm not sure which you put first. I hope it's democracy. Democracy versus authoritarianism. And I think the first thing I want to communicate is that President Biden sees this contest between democracy and authoritarianism as the seminal, definitive, determinative contest of the 21st century. What does that mean? That means he is committed to, and this administration, the administration I represent, has committed to put democracy, democratic principles, and human rights at the heart of foreign policy. And I'm often asked, well, what does that mean? So that, I think, gets to your question of where our priorities are and where the rubber hits the road. But I want to say one thing about this contest, because in conversations with many, many states, not just in the Western world, but globally, there is a concern that this is about great power competition. This is not about great power competition. This is about those countries and those nations that stand by the UN Charter, the international order based on democratic values and principles, the treaties that have been stood up to, and those countries that seek to change borders by might, to rule by might, and to rule with impunity. So we have really sought, within this construct of democracy versus authoritarianism, to do a couple of things. One of them is to really expand the tent. So when we talk about what are the Western responses to what's happening in this region, what can Europe do more of? What can the United States do more of? We're also asking ourselves, what do we need to do more of globally? How do we build the global unity around what's happening in this very region? So I think the president obviously put forward an agenda to hold this summit for democracy, and we can talk about that more if that's of interest to folks. But there's one piece that I want to bring into this discussion from that. In bringing over 100 leaders together, over 50% of whom are not Western, are not from this part of the world, are from the global South, represent the G77. The goal has been to expand the tent around what this contest is. This is not great power competition. This is about the international order and the future that we all agree to live in. And small and medium-sized states, I will tell you, have told us they have more of a stake in this than the great powers because they all depend on that system to allow their borders to continue to be defined as such. We have all seen the Freedom House indicators. We all know the attrition that democracy has been through. So when you ask me in the world that I live in and the day-to-day work that we do, what is on our agenda is literally changing those indicators. That is a daunting task, and we can absolutely not do that alone. So again, we're expanding the tent. 750 commitments were made at that summit. Many of those are domestically oriented. We talked about getting our own houses in order as much as we do abroad. But it again is about building that coalition, that community that says we're going to stand by this. We're going to stand by democracy. What I hope to hear today, because I want to get out of this again as much as I try to put in, is how we tip those scales. What experience we have in this room that shows how we tip those scales. We have 3 priorities in my bureau specifically about tipping those scales in this region. And what we see happening with this very flagrant example of authoritarianism unchecked, of an authoritarianism that has gone unchecked for far too long, and really with the unconscionable, unjustified, unprovoked war against Ukraine. And those 3 stools, if you will, of 3 legs of that stool, if you will, of that strategy are as follows. The first is stay united. We've talked a lot about how to stay united and how that is navigated in very difficult situations, from energy issues to economic issues to sanctions issues, etc. But it is about also sticking up for each other. It's about why Lithuania, I really appreciated the foreign ministers, the former minister's comments, why Lithuania is supporting Taiwan. This is about a global discussion about democratic values. The second is mitigating the negative impacts of authoritarianism. And what do I mean by that? I also mean things like decreasing the dependence on sourcing that comes from autocratic countries. Sourcing in energy, of course, we've all discussed that. It's a very complicated conversation, but also sourcing that comes from the military, sourcing in the economic world. And that is globally. And the third that I would say is going on the offensive with democracy. Going on the defensive. It's not about defending democracy. It's about promoting it. It's about renewing it. It's about renewing it globally. And to do that, I think we need a lot sharper tools. And so a lot of what my bureau is working on is trying to sharpen those tools. What does it mean, for example, to have a digital world that it contributes to digital freedom and contributes to a technology for freedom? That's the kind of discussion that I think we want to have. So with that, I'll pass it back to you and hope for a very open discussion.
Kara, thank you very much for a great start. Why don't I just do this? I'm just going to go down the row here. So Dan, let me turn to you next. Yeah, you wrote with U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan a great piece in Foreign Affairs called "Only Bipartisanship Can Defeat Authoritarian Aggression." And in the beginning you write, "The free world is shrinking, not growing." And then toward the end you write, "Democratic values give the free world a critical advantage in what will likely be another decades-long confrontation with Russia and China, just as they did in the Cold War." Square those 2 sentences for me, if you would.
Thanks, David. I'm very proud to be here with the new leader of the Bush Institute, the new leader of the McCain Institute, the longstanding leader of EPRC, and so many friends from Georgia and elsewhere. Thank you. So look, 2022 is a pivot point in world history. It marks a new era of authoritarian aggression in world affairs. I think sometimes we get lost in these theological debates and we can't see clearly what is quite clear, which is that the dangers to a free and open world emanate from dictatorships. Their domestic repression and abuse of their own citizens' most basic rights is mirrored in aggressive foreign policies that want to take away the rights of independent nations, Ukraine, Taiwan, etc. So if we live in an era of authoritarian aggression, we also know that despite China and Russia, the principal authoritarian aggressors, despite their being so different, they have many things in common. And you don't have to take it from me. You can read the Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin joint declaration at the Beijing Olympics to see how much they think they have in common. Take them at their own word. They want to make the world safe for autocracy. They want to vest sovereignty in autocrats, not in citizens. They want to say countries belong to their leaders, not to their people. They want to have a world of authoritarian spheres of influence. Georgians know what this looks like because they were captive in a Soviet sphere of influence for too many years. They do not want a world in which countries and citizens can make their own choices. And I don't want to live in that kind of world. I'm quite sure friends from Georgia and every other country represented in this room do not want to live in that kind of world. So we're looking out at a multi-decade competition. It's different from the Cold War, but I think we have to think about some of the lessons we learned in the Cold War. One is about the power of alliances, democratic alliances. All of America's principal allies are strong democracies. We have many other security partners, but our strongest and closest allies are all democracies, open systems. So that's a source of security. Why do democracies work together so closely? Because we understand that the great dangers to our own citizens and to our own security emanate from authoritarian regimes. That includes aggression, armed aggression of the kind we see Russia, Ukraine. That includes the export of violent extremism, as Americans saw on 9/11, many other countries have suffered from. That includes the export of uncontrolled mass migration. It's not to say anything negative about mass migration, to say a country like Venezuela, a country like Syria, a third of citizens in these cases have fled their own country with very destabilizing effects beyond their immediate region. We don't want to live in a world where those are the conditions of the day. We want to shape a world in which democratic, accountable, transparent governments are responsive to citizens, solve security problems, and produce prosperity. And David, the final thought here, I'm very confused by arguments that somehow China's developed a different and superior economic model. Russia clearly has no alternative model. But this argument that somehow democracy does not produce prosperity. The richest economies in the world are all market democracies, open systems, rule of law societies. There are a couple exceptions, and they're in the Middle East, and they sit on giant fields of oil and gas. So unless you're sitting on a giant field of oil and gas, it turns out that the surest way to deliver prosperity to your citizens is to offer property rights, rule of law, and all the transparency that comes from accountable and effective institutions. That's how you produce prosperity, and that's how you produce prosperity. And democracies are going to need to work much more closely together in this new era so that the authoritarians don't reshape the world to our disadvantage.
Dan, thanks very much. So, Keti, let me turn to you next. As a key player in civil society here, you look at the region, and are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Of course, you asked me the harshest question. Unfortunately, I cannot see that I'm very optimistic right now. I mean, I'm not optimistic regarding my country. Concerning Ukraine, I am very optimistic. I can see that they are winning, and I am sure they will win. As for my country, actually, yesterday I was remembering when we had this conference first. It was, I think, in 2014. Or 15, but we had a moment when we were developing. We had a moment when we had the first, change of power through elections in 2012, and we were sure that we would be having many of them. We had at one point the first year a cohabitation between president and parliament, which was a very interesting experiment for Georgia. And in the very first years, I'll not be going deeper into our contemporary history, but we really had improvement on different indices when we are talking of Freedom House, like media situation and national government and local government and so on. Unfortunately, I would say, it's hard to say which year exactly, but somewhere from 2016, when the GD already got the constitutional majority, I can say that we are going backwards. Of course, we civil society have been screaming about it and have been trying either to cooperate or to criticize. But what we see now, first of all, GD, which came as a coalition of parties, and many of them being openly pro-Western, pro-democracy, and so on, all of them starting to leave exactly in these years, like 13, 14, 15, and GD developing into one dominant party. And the even worse thing, Ivanishvili that had won, and we should mention his name, we cannot go without it, the guy who had really won the elections in 2012 and had kind of resigned from the prime minister's position, showing his democratic approaches in a year and a half, in reality up to now has been running this country from behind the scenes. So on the one hand, we see the deterioration of the ruling party. On the other hand, we see the deterioration of the democracy scores in Georgia. And where have we come now, as of today? As of today, we have the former president sitting in the prison. And I would say even worse, we have the media manager sitting in the prison for absolutely ununderstandable charges. So, all the major kind of criteria for democracy, courts are under complete influence of the government, and the civil society has been struggling for courts' independence, but now calling them just a clan, which already even international societies repeating. Media kind of having a lot of pluralistic media, but at the same time, all the critical media being either under investigation or under some type of pressure. And civil society, which we still call vibrant, but now it's called actually an enemy by the government. So I hope I'm not exaggerating or being too grim, but we have not gone on a path towards democracy. We have kind of reversed somewhere. And the kind of major hope was now the candidacy for Europe. With Ukraine's tragedy, there was still one opening, for countries like ours, like Moldova and Georgia. There was this window of opportunity of, receiving candidacy and then maybe becoming members of EU. Once again, the government is actually doing everything not to get it, though in reality blaming everybody, blaming the opposition, blaming the civil society, and God knows else whom. Even the embassies sometimes, including the best friend of Georgia, I think, like a former EU ambassador who was blamed right after leaving. So we are not in a very optimistic state. But still, I really have hopes that things will change here again. We'll not be stuck with the same government for another decade. And it's paradoxical, but we are all waiting for Ukraine to win. But of course, it will not be just Ukraine's win. It will be the big win for all of us. And I expect also the win for democracy and less Russian influence, which I can see you want me to stop. Yes. So Russian influence on the rise, but I think this will also be brought down. So let me say I'm half optimistic.
Fair answer. Thank you. Žygas, let me ask you, Linus before talked about what your country is doing. Do Lithuanians feel they are getting the support and solidarity from fellow democracies in the positions that they are staking out? What more can be done to support Lithuania and other countries that are stepping up?
Well, I would say yes. I remember 2008, I was then Deputy Foreign Minister, and I think we were the only country shipping weapons to Georgia. Then it was very, of course, uncivilized way to support democracies. We were alone. I was alone in Brussels asking ministers to introduce sanctions, and I was very much alone to meet Dan Fried in Washington and saying, Dan, what's happening? Well, you all remember what happened. Actually, the West punished Georgia for its leadership on democracy. We did nothing. We embraced Putin. And we now pay for it so dramatically. And, when I'm looking to those people all around, I remember, Senator McCain, and I remember David, I remember Damon, Kurt. You've been doing it all. So when you ask us Lithuanians what to do, look to yourself. You've been, pushing freedom. We've been fighting together. We've been strategizing together. What happened with you? So when I heard President Biden speaking in inaugural speech, everything I was shouting for 2 decades, I was more or less kind of crying. I said, finally, are they really back to their own constitution, to the things that they have to fight for? Well, I would say, it's kind of close to it, but first of all, what we have to do now, pray and kneel in front of Ukrainians and help them with this war, because we are paying for our debts in this Ukrainian war. A lot of people, lost their lives in Georgia and Ukraine because of our stupid policies. So do anything you can, pay everything from your pocket, suffer as much as you want, but win this war. This is the only way for us all to survive. And then just do what you did in the Baltics. Extend the EU. We finally have this candidate status, but ask anybody in Brussels, when will you actually start accession talks with Ukrainians? Oh, very bad question. And we say next year, please, 23. And we are ready to finish it during Lithuanian presidency in 27, and we are ready to applaud to Ukrainian accession to you in 29 before European Parliament is elected and Commission is appointed. This is doable, guys. We did it. I did it. I was deputy chief negotiator. I was living in this Soviet shit for 4 years, and we fixed it. So the same with NATO. All Americans applauding German leadership. My God, I was in Bucharest NATO summit. I was looking to your eyes. Well, Bush eyes were in the good place, but when I see now German leaders fixing themselves, I don't have awards. Do it. You have Vilnius NATO summit in 1 year. Do it, please. You can do it. And then, talking Taiwan, well, okay, we don't know a lot in Taiwan, but this is about the same. It's about the same looking to those, West and seeing them making all possible mistakes in Russia and now doing the same in China. So you learned it. You empowered the beast, and then you are kind of wondering what's happening. So stop doing it with China, please. Embrace Taiwan, embrace wonderful democratic Indo-Pacific world, and finally, create new organizations that could fight with weapons, with everything for democracy, like Rammstein meet. Great United Nations of democracy. What are you doing in those United Nations? It's a mockery of democracy. All those organizations is, hijacked by autocracies. Let's create our own stuff and fight for that. And we can do it. We did it. 3 million of people destroyed the Soviet Union. Looking to those nice eyes of Gorbachev who killed my friends in front of TV tower. We did it, despite all the glories of Red Armies. So Ukrainians, Georgians, we all can do it. Taiwan, 25 million. I don't know how many times more than Lithuanians. We can do it, brothers, but let's do it finally.
She was so good. I wish you would be passionate about these issues. Yascha, I want to step back with you as one of the leading experts on these issues. Bobo took exception to democracy versus authoritarianism. Is that a useful way to look at what we are facing now?
Well, first of all, this is a tough act to follow. I think I just want him to talk for 5 more minutes. Would that be better? Look, so when you hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think when you look at the world through the lens of one narrative, it's easy to miss a lot of complexities. And because we tend to think about the world at the moment with the narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism, I think that there is a real danger. So I think Bobo was right, for example, that when you look at geopolitical alliances right now, it's clear that some democracies are not on the side of Ukraine. And in fact, after this winter, there may be more democracies that are not on the side of Ukraine. That's a real danger. On the other hand, the United States and the Western Alliance has very friendly relations with certain dictatorships that more or less are on that side. even in terms of understanding the nature of regimes, I think there's complexities that go beyond democracy versus dictatorship. One of the things that the last years have really reminded me of is the vast difference between a relatively functional dictatorship with some kind of constraints on the leader, especially if it's, as political scientists say, institutionalized, and dictatorships in which one person makes all of the decisions without any kind of internal restraints. Dictatorships that are starting to be totalitarian in the extent of social control that they exercise, and the extent of allegiance that they command. So absolutely, let's step back and think about ways in which important features of a world might be obscured by just thinking about it in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism. However, I do think that in normative terms, the most important thing that is going on in the world at the moment is that our comfortable and lazy assumptions from 10 or 15 years ago, that democracy is on the march and that a vast area of the world has already won freedom and that it's just a matter of time until it expands to other countries, has turned out to be wrong. And that there is a very serious danger of democracy being lost and independence being lost in Ukraine, obviously, because of the attack on Russia, in countries like Georgia, or for that matter, in countries like the United States. There is a very, very serious danger that the 21st century is going to be written by autocrats in Moscow and in Beijing and in other places. And so for all of the sort of ways in which we can make the narrative more subtle, in which we can and should pay attention to ways in which it obscures certain features of the world, I do think that the conflict between democracy and authoritarianism is the essential political battle of the first half of the 21st century.
Thank you very much for that. Kara, I want to come back to you. I don't want you to get into U.S. domestic politics. That's not the job of people who work in the State Department. But you, I'm sure, hear the whataboutism response when we raise concerns about other countries. How do you address that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, David. So, and I think, the president's speech on Thursday was all things that may or may not be said about it on the social media and on the talk shows, et cetera. It was certainly from the heart in terms of how he sees these issues. I think the whataboutism is simply answered by the fact that it is one of the fundamental strengths of democracy, that it has the ability to self-refine. It is why civil society is so important and should be the partner of government, should be the partner of an opposition, should be the partner of a country moving forward. It's why business is important. It's why parliaments are important. It is a form of government, perhaps the least worst, in the words of a famous Brit, but it is a form of government that allows self-reflection and it allows self-refinement. And I think it was said well this morning that we all have work to do to get our houses in order. And I think we come at this, certainly our government comes at this from a point of humility, very clear humility, that we don't have all the answers. This is not a linear trajectory. We have challenges at home, absolutely we do. But there is a strength that comes from the ability to openly examine that. And I keep coming back to our former Justice of the Supreme Court, Brandeis, who was so interested in corruption and what that means for a country. And, he put forward this idea that the best disinfectant is sunlight, right? Bring it out into the open. That's what civil society is about. That's what holding each other accountable is about. That's what checks and balances are about. So, right, without getting into any domestic politics, I think that what we look for and what we try to support internationally in our foreign policy is this ability to be self-refining and to be self-reflecting and to be open to that and to increase that transparency.
We have a panel at the end of tomorrow about whether the United States, but Dan, I want to ask you because, again, coming back to your terrific piece in Foreign Affairs about bipartisanship on this issue. You completely agree. Are you confident that we will remain strongly supportive of support for democratic forces, human rights around the world, regardless of what happens in our political situation.
Thanks, David. So I would say a couple things. One is in America, we've been working on our democracy for 246 years, and we have work to do. And that's the great thing about democracy, is it creates the institutions for citizens to engage and improve their democracies. That's point one. Point two, I would look to different periods in American history, including the early Cold War, which we wrote about briefly, when statesmen from the Democratic Party and statesmen and women from the Republican Party built an internationalist consensus that essentially guaranteed 70, 75, 80 US Senate votes for major foreign policy initiatives. That lasted through the Vietnam War, really through the Johnson presidency. So it lasted for several decades. You just saw in the United States Senate a 95-1 vote to enlarge NATO. You saw an 89-11 vote to deliver more assistance to Ukraine than the US has single-handedly delivered to any country in a very long time. I think we need to work. I don't see the divides as being between left and right so much. I think we worry about isolationists on both sides of the political spectrum. We worry about what President Obama called nation building at home, which makes sense to a lot of people. And then it's up to statesmen and women, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, to go make the case to their citizens, not just in the United States, but in every country, about why we need to engage and lead abroad, why that circles back very directly to our prosperity, our national security, and frankly, the state and health of our democracy. And last point, for now, is that democracy in the United States or in Georgia or in Ukraine or anywhere cannot flourish in a world of authoritarian aggression. Franklin Roosevelt understood this, Ronald Reagan understood this, many leaders have understood this over the years, that a world in which autocracy is on the march threatens our domestic freedoms, even if we're not interested in foreign policy and national security. So if the health of our democracy is tied to the health of democracy in the world, we need to do more and better.
Oops. There's a mosquito here, which I assume came from Moscow. Keti, Kara mentioned civil society and the important role of that, but civil society is sometimes accused of being the rear guard action for regime change. How do you respond to that and describe the role of civil society in helping democratic development?
Well, I mean, for years it's kind of already assumed that civil society here is pretty large, strong, and vibrant. I mean, of course, when there are changes of regime, civil society is somehow involved. I would not say that we are of the authors of regime change, but of course, civil society is out there, either in the streets or monitoring the election precincts, or, developing some policies for future and so on. Unfortunately, I mean, of course, with every government at one point, the relations are deteriorating, which is normal. We are becoming more critical, and the governments are also either becoming more critical or are disregarding. However, this time, we see something more, I would say. You know, on the one hand, we see this polarization, which is on the rise in Georgia, but unfortunately very much supported by the government. And it's also important that in these 12 priorities that Europe has proposed us for candidacy, for future candidacy, depolarization is one of them, because it's like obvious. However, while even increasing polarization, on the one hand, we see the government accusing the opposition for everything, and then tying us directly to the opposition, exactly when we are ready to play a role of a kind of a middleman, or bringing them together like these two mostly opposing forces for discussions. They are trying to put us in the other basket and put us actually in one basket, all of us. And unfortunately, there have been cases recently when our colleagues, including my employees and me, we have been all accused of something horrible, either wanting war or wanting, not wanting to join the European Union. All these accusations that are absurd, but they are pretty much accumulated in the recent, I would say, months and days. It's also, I think I should mention this, like after the start of war, there has been a very controversial situation in Georgia. On the one hand, and all the polls show this, I mean, 80% of Georgians say that it's our war. It's our war, we know what it is, and we are in complete support of Ukraine. There has been big emotions to help Ukrainians here and help Ukraine over there, though we are a small country, and civil society has been very instrumental in this. On the other hand, we see the government, which is sometimes kind of trying to keep neutrality on these issues, or sometimes making, I would say, controversial at the best. Maybe sometimes you would think that even very capitulantic statements. And we don't see here a lot of government statements in support of Ukraine. There have been some, but very few. And the major thing is we don't hear very clear statements that Russia is aggressor. And we haven't heard name Putin, correct me if I'm wrong, from any government representative recently, as if this guy doesn't exist. So what is this, like a big fear of Russia, or even something more? It's still hard to say, but we definitely see the increased Russian presence and the increased Russian influence, even in economy in Georgia.
Keti, thank you. Zhigas, I want to ask you about the importance of coming to grips with history and accountability. You made reference to the 14 Lithuanians who were killed as the Soviet Union was coming down. The Russian forces and Putin are being accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, even genocide. How important is it to come to grips with a country's war crimes and its historical terrible mistakes?
Well, it's about the same what we talked, when I think everybody saw that movie Munich on Netflix. I saw it so many times during my life, those Munichs, Actually, Georgia 2008 was Munich of 21st century. And again and again. So don't appease dictatorships, no autocracies. Shine, yes, defend United Nations Charter. Our grandfathers, paid such a price for it. And, well, every generation is, of course, just one generation from freedom, and, it's difficult. It's not a material stuff. It's spiritual understanding that you have to do it. Maybe everyone has to learn it, but please learn from your own history, from the history of America. But also coming back a bit to this unity issue, it's so ironic that to each McCain conference, we come with Linus with different chapeaus. We change. He's ruling now, then I'm opposing. Now I'm ruling. He's kind of, social democrat. But we never been together as parties. We fight with each other, those social democrats and Christian Democrats. But we are so much united on Georgia, on every foreign and security policy aspect. And today, we symbolically met with Georgian foreign minister together. And we were asking him just one thing: unity, please, on those 12 points. You have again new chance. I still remember the roadmap, all other chances missed, and again you have a chance. And please look, this is so similar to Lithuanian history. We were kind of stupid in '97, not like Estonians, We were resisting Brussels. We were shouting at Brussels. We didn't want to do a lot of stuff. And then they invited Estonians for accession talks. We fixed ourselves, we united, and they invited us in 2 years. So now Georgia has a chance, but no chance if you still fight with each other. And when I say fight with each other, I mean you all. Please unite. I was working for communists that I hated, really, honestly, hated. But we did it together. And now we kind of remember and write books about that. So please unite, because if you miss another year and another year, Russians will drink a lot of champagne. This is their victory. They kind of, after the war, they left Russian tanks in your hearts and minds. And they still fight. A lot of little tanks here as well.
I'm going to turn to Yascha for the last question from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But Yascha, the sad fact is, among the democratic community of nations, we are not united when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You look at India, you look at Brazil, countries in Africa. How concerning is that when you see Foreign Minister Lavrov traveling in Africa, making the Russian case that this is all because of sanctions that they're facing, a food crisis in other ways? What does it say about the largest democracy in the world not being on board?
Well, it's very worrying. I mean, look, I'm also really worried about what's going to happen in Europe after this winter, right? You're going to have very serious increases in food and energy prices. You're going to have potentially certain forms of shortages. All of this is 100% because of the cowardice of these countries over the last 10 or 20 years, because of their lack of clarity and their lack of strategic thinking. Going back to the first question you asked me, one of the prices you pay when you don't look at the world at all through a perspective of democracy versus authoritarianism is that you can convince yourself that deals for gas with Putin are a purely economic matter that has no political implications. And then you essentially become dependent in your autonomy and in your ability to make decisions on a dictator in the Kremlin who can decide whether or not your pensioners can heat their homes. But now we're in the situation where some pensioners are going to struggle to heat their homes, and I worry about the political consequences that that's going to have internally in terms of the rise of extremist parties, but also externally in terms of a willingness of these governments to actually stand with Ukraine as relatively clearly as they have over the course of the last 6 or 7 months. So the unity of democracies is fundamentally important. It's very worrying that countries like India and Brazil are not clearly standing with Ukraine. But I even want to enlarge the set of questions here, which is that if we're thinking about whether the world is going to be a democratic world in 2050 or 2075 or 2100, if we think about whether we're able to have this horrible term, the rules-based order, in a sustainable way, so that through the end of our lives and the lives of our children, we can have peace and prosperity in the world, that question is going to be decided in India, in Brazil, Nigeria, in Kenya, and many of those countries. And so I think we need a much clearer vision for how to make those values convincing and relevant, how to bring those values to parts of the world in which there's brave activists fighting for them, brave civil society organizations fighting for them, but in which we can do more to model why they should embrace fully that vision and make it their own. Because the 21st century is only going to be a democratic century if its heartland migrates from the United States and France to Ukraine and Georgia and Nigeria and India.
Thank you. Turn to the audience. I see James. We'll come to all these. James first. James Nixie right there. Tali, did you have?
Thank you very much. Is it working this time? Yeah. How does a panel, please, square the notion that Dan expressed that you can't live with or tolerate an authoritarian Russia, a fascistic regime like Russia, because it negatively affects our own societies, our own democracies, it means us harm, it does us harm, with not calling for a change of that regime, i.e. regime change, which I didn't hear you call for, but maybe I missed the subtext. How do you square those two?
Let's take one more, Vitaly, right here in front.
I just have a quick comment. Do you want me to do it right away? Well, hi, my name is Vitaly Shklerov. I'm a former Harvard Fellow and Belarusian activist. I just want to quickly comment. First of all, David, thank you so much for a great panel. It's wonderful, and I just want to quickly comment because Kara said about self-defining and huge role of civil society and about partner of the opposition, being a partner of opposition. I just want to remind you that that's where we've been talking a lot about how to support Ukraine, whether or not, and how quick to deliver weapons and military and financial support. So I believe the support starts right a couple levels below, talking about opposition, talking about political prisoners. And in this sense, I just want to remind you how many political prisoners and how many activists are still suffering in Belarus, in the country where I'm from. That's are over 1,300. And in this sense, in Russia, Vladimir Kramer, Navalny, Yashin, and so on. And I believe that's where the support should start. We are asking ourselves what we can do, whether to deliver weapons or not, and in which capacity. But look how we do support opposition. In Georgia, the famous oppositional channel is about to close. In Georgian, editor-in-chief of main oppositional channel is in prison. In Belarus, there are over 1,300 political prisoners. And talking about Linas and Žygimantas, I just want to say thank you guys, because in a way, Lithuania was the only European country, talking about leadership, to support and recognize Svetlana Tikhanovskaya 2020 after 35,000 people were arrested. The only European country, get it, only European country to recognize not the leader of opposition, but fairly elect, legitimately elect president-elect of Belarus. There's not a single country yet in Europe to recognize her, to give her credentials, diplomatic credentials, and help the opposition that suffers daily to get out of misery. Because as someone of the panelists said it before, I believe previous panel, we don't have to send troops to Ukraine. We just can deliver money and weaponry. So the same here. You don't have to get to Georgia or Belarus or Armenia or whatever. Just support the groundwork of opposition and civil activists. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you. I did want to give you that opportunity to take the floor because obviously what's happening in Belarus needs much more attention than it's been getting. Regime change, was that directed to you?
Yeah, I don't know why it was directed at me, but I'll take it.
You're the tallest one on the panel.
So look, it's people in these countries who have to do the work, right? It's not up to the United States or anybody else. We know, for instance, in Belarus, that most Belarusians are opposed to the war. We know that the woman who won the elections in Belarus 2 years ago is opposed to the war and has condemned the war. There would be no Russian assault on Ukraine through Belarus if Belarus was a democracy. I mean, you can just magnify that around the world. It's for Belarusians to do that work. It's for Russians to do that work. Ukrainians have done that work. A Ukrainian friend reminded us over the weekend, Ukraine's had 3 democratic revolutions just in the last generation, fighting for greater public voice, accountability, transparency. The reason Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine is because he saw Ukrainians throw out a corrupt dictator in the Maidan in 2014, and he's worried that someday Russians will do that to him. So I love it when people tell me, people who live in comfortable democracies, they say, oh, this is ideological. You know, we have to be realistic. What's realistic is to understand that autocrats are driven by ideological insecurity around letting people have a choice, which is why Putin controls his elections, which is why Xi Jinping is about to be heralded as leader of China for life without any public input, right? So I think we have to be quite confident in the values of people. IRI works in 100 countries. In all of those 100 countries, people want a greater voice, greater dignity, greater accountability from their leaders. So there's no geopolitical project. I think Kara's right. We should trust in people to make sound choices, and the world would be better if people could elect their rulers everywhere.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this?
I'll weigh in just really quickly about the dissonance that you signaled. I think we see internal repression and external aggression as 2 sides of the same coin. So when we see, for example, transnational repression, the export of autocratic models, misuse of multilateral institutions to go after dissidents, this is just an expression externally of what's happening internally. So very much, I think, in terms of how we approach these issues generally, it is with that holistic view. I also want to thank you so much for raising Belarus, because it's very much on our priority list. We have been absolutely supporting, stalwart supporters of not only Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, but of all of those who have paid with their family members' lives, their lives, who are still in prison, 1,300, I think, still in prison. It is absolutely an imperative that we can continue to call this out and not allow Lukashenko to escape responsibility for the facilitation he has done of this war.
Well, just one word. I agree on Belarus, but you know what? I remember Senator McCain again. He was teaching me, focus, make things work. Not enough of talks. If all of our nations would concentrate on this, if in 2-3 months we kill Putin regime in Ukraine with everything we have, and it's an easy fix to all our problems. Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Europe, Holland Free, you name it. So thank you, Nino, to pointing it. Just do it. Americans, everyone, Germans, Brits, French, you have it. You have it all what is needed. We gave everything what we have, and we will give it even more. Fix it, 2-3 months. And then, no more conferences, just no more conferences.
Well, I was with you right up until the end. We'll come back to that over dinner. Georgi, then Batu, and then right there. We'll try to take these last four.
Thank you. I'm Georgi Gandalaki with European Georgia. When non-democracies become democracies, and conversely when democracies break down, this always has profound geopolitical consequences. Belarus is one example. Back in the day, it was a promising emerging European democracy when Lukashenko won free and fair elections. I think there is a consensus now that in Georgia we're having a democratic backsliding. And one of the things that this war has exposed is that this process has been accompanied with Georgia's gradual drift towards the Kremlin orbit. Georgia is in icy relations with Ukraine. I would even call it diplomatic war. President Zelensky has recalled ambassador from Georgia, and he did that for a reason. And do you think the geopolitical consequences of this democratic backsliding going even further are fully understood and reflected upon in key capitals? Thank you.
Thanks. Just hand it over to Batu, Georgi. Thanks.
Thank you, Batu Kutelia. Žygis, thank you very much. I'm pretty sure, if not in previous life, in next life you will be Georgian. For sure. But one thing you mentioned, and you rightly so, called us to unite. And there are different angles to view on it, on the state of Georgia or Georgia's society. I would dispute it. We are united. 80% of Georgians want in Europe. 80% of Georgians want to live by the rule of law. 80% of Georgians want to be in NATO, to contribute to overall Euro-Atlantic security. But the problem is that the ones who have power in this country, they serve the one person who is a reclusive billionaire. Everyone who is potentially or formally in charge, one way or another, being a servant of that particular person. We have security service who serves this one person or a group of people. They are serving diplomats, they are serving journalists, they are wiretapping priests. They use violence, they finance violence groups to pit up journalists. All political party opposition leaders are called radical opposition and labeled like this. There are criminal kind of cases against them. So my quick question right now is, while we are united what we want, but we ended up where we ended up. And it's a question to all panelists. Is Georgia a democracy from your standpoint?
Batu, hand it to the woman right behind you there, and I'll take that last question right there.
Okay,
Sorry for all these, but
Thank you. Tamtam Muradashvili. I represent the Tavari channel. I'm the lawyer and director of the channel. Thank you for mentioning Nika Guaramia's case. Actually, Sophia, Nika's wife, is here with me today. Ms. Kara McDonald mentioned the word agenda and about promoting democracy. My question is it in U.S. agenda and a strategic decision to intensify and increase support of freedom of speech in Georgia and free media and their fight against politicized justice and politicized prosecution? Because, and especially considering the context, the Ukraine war, war is not about the military power, right? Because there's information war, and one can say sometimes it's more powerful than the military one. And there's no democracy without free speech, and we talk about promoting democracy. The Georgia's case has proven, and our case has proven, that the most practical and tangible means to fight against authoritarianism is free media. So is it a strategic decision, and is it in the U.S. agenda to support Georgian free media? Thank you.
Thank you. Giga, sorry, I promised her the last question. We'll hear from you tomorrow, I promise. Last question there, right there, standing up. Hold on for a mic. There. Oh, can I get up?
Here for quite a while. Huh?
Sorry?
How long? I mean, it's more than an hour already. Or now?
Thank you so much. My name's Kim Cordova. I'm with the Harvard Graduate School of Design. You've spoken so much about the importance of articulating convincing and relevant values, that this is a fight for a vision of the future. So I'm wondering, in what way would you call in the arts and cultural sector to be comrades, or maybe that's the wrong word, but to be aligned in this struggle?
All right, who wants to start? We can quickly run down
Sure.
the panel and we'll wrap up with this.
Sure.
Kara,
you
go
want
ahead.
me to start?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Free media, 100%. The answer to that is a resounding yes. So when I talked about sharpening the tools of going on the offensive, free media is a part of that. Absolutely. I think I cannot express enough our concern about what we see happening with civil society, ISFED, with independent media here in Georgia. I'm so appreciative for your presence here. Why? Because we're great friends of Georgia, and we have invested. We're not bystanders. We're investors. We're shareholders in Georgia. We care very much, but we can't want it more than they do. We can't want it more than you do. So that gets back to Dan's point, I think, about sort of it coming from within. And I would really echo the sentiment from the last panel about don't lose the opportunity. Do not lose this opportunity. You do not know how many times it will come around again. And we stand by, ready to support. Okay, that's free media. Just quickly on the Georgia geopolitical consequences. Yes, absolutely that is recognized. I do agree that what happens in Ukraine is going to affect here in Georgia. And so this is why I think we have this focus and this laser focus on the war against Ukraine. But absolutely, it has import. It absolutely has import. The last thing I want to say, if you'll permit me, David, Putin did not expect, in military planning, right, you have all the assumptions listed. And Putin made two wrong assumptions. He did not expect two things. He did not expect the bravery of the Ukrainian people to push back, and he did not expect unity from not just the West, but the globe. That's the strategy to victory, right there. Never forget the power of people to fight for their own human dignity and freedom.
Yeah. So just very quickly, I would love to speak to a few of the issues in Georgia with reference to Ukraine. You know, sometimes you hear arguments, you need a strong government to protect the country, or, you know, you have to limit free media for reasons of national security, or you have to control civil society because they maybe influence agents of foreign influence, this and that. I think we should look at Ukraine. Putin did not think it was a real country. He believed his own propaganda. He thought he could kill or capture the leader and the country would collapse. But it turns out that Ukraine is a very resilient democracy with real and strong democratic institutions, elected mayors and governors, not just the leaders, in Kyiv, and a very vibrant civil society. We have Ukrainian civil society leaders with us today. All of those people together collectively have helped protect and defend Ukraine in its moment of maximum peril. Investments in democratic resiliency, including free media, independent courts, very strong civil society, effective institutions, that is the surest source of security for any country, including a country like Georgia.
Can I ask the people over on this side to shut up? Please. Keti.
Yeah, I think Batu meant you guys to respond, but I'll also try to respond to this. Where are we? Are we democracy? Are we autocracy? I think neither one nor the other. Actually, we have never developed into a consolidated democracy, but we have been moving somewhere on the spectrum of hybrid, you know, like half democracy. However, now when I was thinking like where we belong, the closest we came, it's competitive authoritarianism. This is this term of Lukanoway and Levitsky, where it's, I mean, on the one hand, we do have plurality of parties, I mean, incredible amount of parties. We have plurality of media, we have civil society, and we have elections. But the other thing is that for the last 10 years, elections end with the same results, with the ruling party, I mean, becoming a dominant party, always getting the results in their favor. So this is like this competitive authoritarianism, I think cannot be staying like this. It will either move into like, I don't know, either dictatorship or complete authoritarianism, or it can go back or force to democracy. I think that's where we are now.
Well, just replying to Batu's question about Georgian identity of Lithuanian souls. Well, yes, we are called Georgians of the Baltics, you know it. And we are proud of it, because we are proud of you. We know you for ages. You are a biblical nation. You know, to compare with Lithuanians, we've been just starting to kill first Russians when you've been doing a lot of stuff here. You are most creative, you are intellectual, we feel it, you can do it, you can do you and NATO. But you know what? Russians, in some interesting way, you know, KGB is one of the best psychologists. They were able to turn your best qualities against each other. So turn it all against the Russians and win that war, finally. That's in your hands.
Yascha, the last word to you.
Well, there was a question earlier about pessimism and optimism, and I want to just zoom out, because there's a lot of reasons for pessimism that all of us can think of. I just flew in from the United States. There's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic about what's happening in the country and is going to happen in the country in 2024. I'm flying on to Italy. I think there's some reasons to be concerned about the upcoming elections there. Lots of reasons to be worried in the world. I do think that fundamentally there's two reasons to be optimistic about democracy that haven't really changed in 25 or 30 years, and that actually have been confirmed by developments this year, particularly in Ukraine. The first is that there still isn't a credible alternative to democracy that actually has real ideological pull and appeal to a large number of people. There are some semi-authoritarian regimes that are relatively efficient, like Singapore, but there is no model that people in other countries want to emulate. And that, I think, is a very important reason to be optimistic about democracy, because there just isn't a sustainable alternative to it. And then the second reason is that, human beings are idiots. And when we have something good, it's easy to take it for granted and to forget about it. But when we lose it, we come to really regret it. And that's often how we feel about liberty and democracy. When countries are democratic, they complain and they talk about all of the problems, that are real problems often, and they're even willing to vote for people who undermine those democracies. But when they lose their liberty, or when the national independence is under threat, they do rise to the occasion. And we've seen that so powerfully in Ukraine over the last months. And so when you ask me about where we're going to be in 25 or 50 or 100 years, perhaps somebody will invent a political system that makes democracy second best. It's imaginable, but I don't see any indications of it. And until that is the case, I do think that even under really difficult circumstances, people will fight for the freedom and they will fight for democracy, and that does make me optimistic.
It has been my distinct privilege and pleasure to moderate this great panel. Kara, Dan, Keti, Žygas, Yascha, thanks so much.
And you, David.
Žygas, go ahead. So ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's session. We'll be back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. For